A warm greeting to everyone who is participating in this course on self-knowledge. Today we arrive at topic number 27, where we will study a very important technique for advancing in the work of psychological death. This method is known as the technique of the details. By practicing this technique, we will be able to completely dissolve any psychological I. And as we apply it, we will also begin to see clearer results in the process of balancing our energy centers through psychological death. This balance, in turn, makes it possible for us to achieve perfect chastity in each of our centers. This chapter is esoterically titled Death. Why? Because the moment a person begins to disintegrate their defects, they begin to step outside the circle in which all of humanity is caught. They begin to die to the ego, and at the same time their spiritual side begins to awaken and come to life. The things of the ego no longer attract them. All the forces that move humanity, greed, anxiety, lust, fear, vanity, pride, envy, gradually lose their meaning. Instead, the person discovers something far greater within themselves. They begin to perceive a deeper, more transcendental purpose for their existence. So when such a person is invited to commit some misdeed, others may say, "Don't bother with him, he's already dead." And in a way they are right, because he no longer follows the path of ordinary humanity. To those who still want to live inside the ego, we may appear to be dead, even insensitive. But the truth is, we are no longer reacting mechanically to the desires of the ego. Instead, our attention is fixed on awakening that divine essence, which is what we truly are, and stop misusing our so valuable energy to make superior creations with it. Within every human being there exists a divine spark. Some traditions call it the soul, others name it the buddhata, and still others call it the essence. The names may change depending on the culture, but the reality is the same. It is that sacred spark that lives deep inside of us. It is this spark that moves us, that inspires us, that gives us the strength to begin a spiritual path. It is what awakens in us the yearning to seek, the longing to understand, and the will to truly work on ourselves. But this essence, this soul that we carry within, is, for the moment, trapped. It is imprisoned in all of our defects, in all of those psychological I's, which together form what is esoterically called the ego. These defects are the very things that prevent the essence from expressing itself freely. They are what stop us from thinking, feeling, and acting consciously, because they take over the voice and the control of the person. However, as we begin the work of disintegrating those defects, something changes. Little by little, this divine essence grows, it strengthens, and it starts to manifest with greater clarity and greater force. And in that process, it gradually becomes a true soul. There is yet another divine spark within us, another part of our spirit, which we call the Divine Mother. Just as each one of us has an inner father, who represents the wisdom of our consciousness, so too do we all have our own inner mother. Her sacred mission is to disintegrate the psychological defects that we have observed and understood. She does this with a spear that she carries, a symbol of the power of our sexual energy. Throughout history and across different cultures, this aspect of consciousness has been represented in many different forms. But all of these representations point to the same truth: the feminine side of our inner divinity, whose role is to cleanse us from the ego we carry within. That is why, whenever we notice even the smallest detail of ego manifesting in ourselves, we must turn inward and ask, "My mother, eliminate this defect. Disintegrate it with your spear." And she will do so, because that is her mission, to help us free ourselves in this way. When we begin to observe ourselves sincerely, when we recognize and judge our negative ways of being, this divine aspect of our inner nature awakens. It comes into activity. And as we call upon her to disintegrate the I's that we observe, we start to feel her power, and we begin to witness the great inner changes that unfold within us. Now let us take a closer look at what the technique of the details actually is. This practice will allow us to sharpen our self-observation and to move forward more quickly and effectively in the process of psychological death. To understand how this technique works, we can compare the ego and its way of functioning to something very familiar: a tree. If we look at the structure of a tree, we'll notice something interesting. While the tree is held upright by its thick main roots, those aren't the ones that actually feed it. Their purpose is different. They anchor the tree, they hold its weight, and they keep it from toppling when the winds blow. The ones that actually feed the tree are the tiny roots, those delicate, almost hair-like roots that spread throughout the soil. These small roots are the ones that absorb the sap, the nutrients, that keep the tree alive. Now, this is exactly how the ego functions in us and in all of humanity. We can compare the ego of a person to a large tree. The thick roots that support it represent the capital defects: lust, greed, anger, pride, envy, and so on. These are the main structure of the ego, often called the heads of the legion, or the deadly sins. And just as with the tree, the tiny roots represent the details, the subtle, everyday manifestations of the ego in us. These details are the countless small ways in which our defects express themselves moment by moment. They appear in our emotions, in what we feel. They whisper in our mind, through the thoughts that arise constantly. They show themselves in mechanical reactions of the body, in the words we speak, and in the way we act. Often these manifestations seem so small, so subtle that we don't even recognize them as defects. But if we observe carefully, we see that these small details are what nourish and sustain the bigger defects. The ego feeds on them, and we don't realize just how much energy is being stolen from us by these constant little expressions. For example, sarcasm may seem harmless, yet if we look deeper, behind a sarcastic comment we may find pride, superiority, criticism, or rejection. Or we might notice a stream of negative thoughts. At first, they seem insignificant, but in reality they are quietly feeding fear, self-pity, discontent, or envy. When we observe impatience, intolerance, or resentment, we see how each small expression of these states keeps our anger alive. Or take lust, tiny details such as curiosity, fantasies, morbid interest, or the habit of consuming obscene content. Each one is a small root feeding that larger defect. Even picking up a coin that doesn't belong to us, a detail we hardly notice, feeds greed. So we begin to see that each of our defects is continually nourished by countless small details. And all of this together sustains the great tree of the ego. That is why our task is to sharpen our self-observation so we can notice more and more of these details, especially the small, subtle ones. Because as we observe and work on them, we gain the power to disintegrate any negative way of being within us. And sometimes these details are even more deceptive. They disguise themselves as if they were consciousness. They appear as good intentions, or as something acceptable. But when we examine them closely, we realize they are still defects, only filtered through the personality, through the image we want others to see, or through the concepts we have absorbed from outside. They do not come from real understanding in our consciousness. Let us take an example to better understand this idea of details, using the defect of greed. Greed is that I within us that, on the one hand, driven by desire, always wants to have more so that it can waste, and on the other hand, motivated by fear, is always afraid of lacking something. This is why it lives in a constant state of wanting to accumulate money. Now, if we look closely, we can identify some of its bigger details. For instance, the ambitious self, the part of us that creates plans, projects, and desires in order to obtain more than we actually need. Another major detail is the thief self. This is the part of greed that tries to satisfy its desires by taking what doesn't belong to us. And this can show itself in very subtle ways in small details, such as taking a pen that isn't ours and keeping it, picking up a coin or a bill we find on the ground that doesn't belong to us, or borrowing something and not returning it. We may come up with many justifications for doing so, but those justifications are themselves further small details of this same I. But there are also other details that seem good on the surface, but when we observe and judge them, we find that they also belong to greed and indirectly feed it. For example, worrying about not having enough money to pay for certain things. We may think that this worry is consciousness, that it is responsibility, but in reality, these are simply concepts of personality, and they hide a series of small details, such as complaint, frustration, fear, comparison, anxiety, victimization, lack of acceptance, giving money and material things too much importance, lack of trust in our inner being as the true provider of all things, or a sense of self-sufficiency. And we fail to see that each of these details is quietly stealing huge amounts of energy from us. Worse, they are indirectly feeding that greedy eye, which remains obsessed with material things. And because of this, it leaves us without the courage, the time, or the energy we need to dedicate to the real work, awakening our consciousness. And so in the same way, we can discover countless details behind every defect. The key is to expand our self-observation, to carefully discover all the details of the psychological defect that is manifesting in us at each moment, and then to ask our Divine Mother to eliminate each one. Let us remember, within us there are many psychological defects, and it is these defects that have trapped our consciousness. That is why we must begin observing ourselves carefully, so we can discover the thousands upon thousands of details that make up those defects, the very details that nourish the trunk of the ego. This means becoming aware of our mind at all times, watching every thought that arises. It means becoming aware of our heart, observing each emotion that manifests in us moment by moment. And it also means observing our sexual center, which is closely connected with both our instincts and our motor activities. In all of these areas, we can find the small and large details of the ego, and with the help of our own Divine Mother, we can eliminate them. What we are really doing is cutting off the food supply of that tree, removing the tiny roots that sustain it. These roots are the negative details, the harmful thoughts, the hatred we may feel, the envy we carry toward others, ambition, lies, words spoken with pride. All of these are details that sustain the ego. And so, if we are serious about our inner work, we must begin disintegrating them. In this way, the tree of the ego will begin to lose its nourishment. It will stop growing, and eventually it will dry up. And as that happens, another tree will flourish within us, the inner tree of consciousness, which represents the wisdom of our being. This tree will begin to develop, to grow, and to gain strength in us. Through this work of the death of the ego, we acquire what is called scientific chastity. This is the purification of our sexual energy, achieved by bringing balance to our centers, by practicing right feeling, right speaking, right thinking, and right acting. When we reach this balance, our sexual energy becomes pure. And with that purity, when we practice supersex with our partner, the sacred fire of the Kundalini can be ignited within the spine. This is what allows us to enter the path of initiation and to begin the creation of our internal bodies. At the same time, the death of the ego also opens the door to love for humanity. Because in order to truly love others, we must begin by loving ourselves. Not in an egotistical way, but by loving our consciousness, by valuing it, and by demonstrating that love through the work we do to free it and awaken it. And when we do this, we are rewarded with wisdom. Wisdom that allows us to serve, to guide, and to help others more and more effectively. What we are teaching here is not meant to remain as theory. It is something to be lived, something to be practiced. Wherever you go, whether you're at work, at home, or in any activity, pay attention to your mind, your heart, and your sex. These are the three main channels through which every defect manifests itself. And when you notice a defect expressing itself in any of these centers in that very moment, make the request to the Divine Mother to disintegrate it. That is the key. We sincerely hope that today's conference has been clear and that it inspires you to practice this powerful technique. If you apply it, you will begin to see profound changes within yourself and in your life. And remember, you are always welcome to share any questions that may arise. In our next conference, we will turn to a very interesting topic, the Christ force. We will explore what this well-known force truly is, the very same force that many masters throughout history have incarnated. We will learn what is meant by the universal Christ and by the individual Christ, and we will see how the possibility of incarnating that state of consciousness is alive within each one of us. So, you are warmly invited to join us. Until next time.